Think back to 1995. You're sitting in your elementary school classroom. The air probably smells like floor wax and chalk. There's this kid in the back row who is vibrating out of his seat. He's throwing pencils, he's talking over the teacher, knocking his desk over from time to time. The teacher sighs, writes his name on the board like they always used to do, and essentially writes him off as a kid that has ADHD. And you're sitting in the middle row. You're not throwing pencils, you're just staring out the window, completely lost in some sort of daydream. Or maybe, possibly, you're picking at your cuticles, your heart is just hammering out of your chest because you forgot to do the homework and you're terrified of being called on because you're afraid of letting people down or being embarrassed that you don't know the answer. Well, because you weren't flipping a desk, the system looked right past you. So today we're going to be opening the time capsule to look at the raw, unfiltered truth of why we were left behind and the devastating price that we paid growing up in the 1990s trap. This is part one of a special 4-part series called ADHD, The Lost Generation. So let's jump into it. This is Wild Focus. All right, and welcome back to another but very special episode of the Wild Focus podcast. If you have not yet, please take a moment to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a review. Make sure to follow the show and myself on all social media, including YouTube. So without further ado, let's jump into this very special part one of a 4-part series. As I said in the beginning, this is part one, and we're calling this the 1990s trap. I'm 39 years old, and if you do the math, that means I was born in 1987. And if you were born anywhere between the mid 70s and the late 90s, I'm going to be talking directly to you during this series. We are the epicenter of the most systematically underdiagnosed generation in modern history. Let's talk some facts with that, because to understand your childhood, you have to understand how broken the medical system was back when we were kids. How and why did an entire generation of us get completely missed? Well, first, let's look at how the medical community actually defined ADHD back then. In the 80s and the 90s, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, viewed ADHD through a very hyper narrow, incredibly biased lens. Until 1994, the medical community heavily equated ADHD with physical hyperactivity. And who exhibits external disruptive hyperactivity the most? Young boys. So the diagnostic criteria was literally designed by observing school-age boys who were annoying their teachers. It was a disorder of behavioral disruption and not an internal executive deficit. If a kid wasn't actively making it impossible for a teacher to manage the classroom, the assumption was that the kid was fine. There's nothing wrong there. Second thing that we need to look at is there was a massive cultural stigma surrounding the actual diagnosis itself. So in the 1990s, ADHD was often weaponized in the media as a fad diagnosis or a byproduct of bad parenting. So pop psychology books and even evening news segments screamed that kids were just eating too much sugar, watching too much MTV, or playing too many video games. Parents, honestly, were probably pretty terrified of the label because it felt like a public report card on their failure as caregivers. So, to avoid the stigma, families and schools would kind of bend over backwards to find any other explanation: laziness, daydreaming, or just this eccentric personality, rather than admitting that a child might be neurodivergent. Well, finally, we were trapped by the myth of the good student. All right. So the prevailing medical belief in the 1990s was that if you had ADHD, you were failing school. You were failing classes left and right. Intellectual capability and executive dysfunction were viewed as mutually exclusive. If you had a high IQ, you could ace the test using panic induced hyperfocus at 2 a.m. So your report card looked great because your grades were fine. Nobody cared that your room looked like a crime scene or your backpack was a black hole and your mental health was already starting to fracture at that young of an age. The system completely ignored the massive internal cost of achieving good grades. If you were a girl, if you had what we now call an attentive ADHD, you didn't stand a chance. The data shows that back then boys were diagnosed at a rate of roughly 4 to 1 compared to girls. But today, adult diagnosis between men and women are nearly equal at this point. That meant millions of young girls were just completely erased from the medical radar. Why was that? Because their hyperactivity wasn't physical, it was verbal. They were labeled chatterboxes, or their hyperactivity was entirely internal, a mind racing at 100 miles an hour, masked by sheer exhausting anxiety. Because medicine failed to give us a label for our struggling brains, our teachers, our parents, and society gave us different labels instead. Now, if you can, I want you to think back to your report cards, the ones that we all avoided, the ones that we tried everything to hide from our parents. The what must have blew out of my hand, walking to the school bus. The window was open on the school bus. I had my report card out. I swear I'm doing really good, but this big old gust of wind just swooped it out. Swear to you, that's what happened. But think back to those report cards. What did those comments say? Has much potential if they would just try. A pleasure to have in class, but easily distracted. Needs to work on their organizational skills. Or my favorite, it's just showing signs of laziness in class. Let's be honest. What happens to a 9-year-old kid when they hear those words repeatedly? When you have ADHD, you are already trying. You are trying with every single ounce of your soul just to do what seems to come effortlessly to everybody else in class. You're exerting 10 times the cognitive energy just to sit still and remember your notebook. But when you pour 100% of your effort into something and the adults in your life just look at you and say, you're just lazy and you're not even trying right now, your brain at that age starts to make some terrifying calculations. You don't think, oh, you know what? The system it has a flawed understanding of neurodiversity. No, at that age, you think, I am trying as hard as I can, and it's still not enough. Therefore, I must be fundamentally broken. I must be bad. I must be stupid. This is where the trauma of the lost generation honestly begins. We internalize moral failure before we even hit puberty. We built our entire identities around the idea that our struggle was a character flaw. And because we thought we were just uniquely defective, we developed some wild, hyper specific behavioral habits just to cope. Looking back now, though, these habits are almost funny, but at the time, they were our survival gear in life. Raise your hand if your 90s bedroom looked like an absolute disaster zone. But the moment your parents ordered you to clean it, you suddenly became hyper focused, but in the wrong way. You essentially became a hyper focused museum curator. This is what I mean by that. You would find this old Tamagotchi or a single Lego piece from back in 1992. And for the next 4 hours, you would sit cross-legged on the floor, deeply investigating this relic while your room remained completely destroyed and untouched. You weren't defying your parents. Your brain just got hijacked because they saw this shiny object that you had forgotten about. Or let's take it back to, back to the school and think about the supplies that we had back then. Every September, August, September, you get that pristine neon colored Trapper Keeper. You all had Trapper Keepers. Don't lie to me. You promised yourself, this is the year I become organized. Everything's going to be hole punch. I'm going to put those little lit dividers in there with the tabs that you can write so freaking tiny of what the subject was, and you would file everything that had to do with that right behind it, so you always knew where it was. You never lost anything. You could always pull it out in the blink of an eye and say, here you go. But by mid-October, that Trapper Keeper wasn't a filing system, was it? It was a graveyard for crumpled up, unnested worksheets, 3-week-old permission slips, and loose graphite stained pencil shavings, or those loose individual pencil leads from the mechanical pencils. That's where they all lived. And of course, let's be honest, we all would do it like hand doodles all over the Trapper Keeper as well too, just to keep our minds fascinated with something in the middle of class. But that Trapper Keeper became what we now know as our doom pile. You couldn't zip the bitch shut because it was just like this unstable accordion. It was just there, and whatever you did, there's some piece of paper sticking out of the little zipper, and you had a hell of a time opening the son of a bitch again. We all know what that's like. We all loved Trapper Keepers back in the day. But let's switch it up a little bit now and let's think about the media that we consumed back then. Did you listen to the exact same CD track on your Sony Discman, 50 times in a row until that laser essentially burned right through the damn plastic? I know I did. Gosh, at that point, I can't even remember what I was jamming out to. Probably some boy band. O-Town? Yeah, probably O-Town. If anybody remembers O-Town, drop a comment. That dirty, dirty boy band. But there was always a song that we loved that we just could not get enough of. By doing that, that was your brain desperately milking the last drop of dopamine out of a song that we were obsessed with. I want to take a quick second to pause and to talk about my company, Weekend Wild. It's an outdoor lifestyle brand built around one idea: spend less time on your screens and more time outside. If you head over to weekendwildmi.com, mi.com, you can check out all the gear that we have. And if you use the code WildFocus15, you can get 15% off your entire purchase. Now, this is the part that really means a lot to me. 10% of all sales goes to supporting the DNR Stepping Stones program, which is a nonprofit that is dedicated to helping individuals and families gain access to the outdoors. So if you want to support the podcast along with the DNR Stepping Stones program, please go to weekendwildmi.com today and use that code WildFocus15. Did you ever read a whole chapter of a book for school, but then realize that you hadn't absorbed a single syllable because you were thinking about a commercial that you saw 3 days ago, and then you had to reread it over and over again, just hoping and praying that something finally stuck? I did all the time. I still have that issue. I will get through a chapter and then I will sit there like, well, what did I take away from that? Not a damn thing is what I took away from that. Let's go back and read all 24 pages again. Now, let's talk about some physical quirks that we displayed. So the constant aggressive foot tapping that made the entire row of school desks shake. The entire class hated you because it was always, especially if you had those windbreaker pants. Again, I know other people had those. The swoosh, swoosh, the swooshing of them. Yeah, you're tapping your knee in those. Oh, you are public enemy number one for that class. But the compulsive cuticle picking under your desk until fingers bled, the need to doodle those elaborate, repetitive geometric patterns all over the margins of your notebooks just so your brain had enough background noise and stimulation to hear a little bit of what the teacher was saying. We didn't know at that time that these were stimming behaviors to regulate our under aroused nervous systems. We just thought that we were fidgety and kind of weird kids. But to survive the day-to-day pressure, we became absolute freaking masters of the mask. At that young of an age, our entire adolescence was basically this elaborate, exhausting theater production designed to convince the world that we were completely normal. Masking in the 1990s was honestly a full-time unpaid job for us. It meant developing a highly sophisticated internal alarm system. You became the master of the controlled panic. You didn't study for weeks. You used the absolute terror of a looming deadline to force your brain to dump enough adrenaline and dopamine to write a 10-page paper in 4 hours. You survived high school on this diet of pure adrenaline, sugary soda, and existential dread. Masking meant hiding your true self at all costs. If you forgot somebody's name or missed instructions because you zoned out, you didn't ask for clarification. Instead, you smiled, you nodded, and relied on your hyper vigilance to piece together what was happening based on just contextual clues. You became this teenage detective in your own life, constantly terrified of being outed as a fraud. Some of us masked by becoming a chronic people pleaser. Honestly, I think a majority of us did. If we couldn't control our internal focus, we could at least control how much people liked us. That was the trade-off. If we were perfectly polite and eager to help, teachers, parents, they wouldn't look too closely at those chaotic lockers or trapper keepers or unfinished long-term projects that we were working at. Others mask by becoming the class clown. If you can control the room with a joke, you get to control the narrative. If everybody is laughing at your quick wit, they're not looking at your failing math grades. or the fact that you just lost your textbook again that trimester. We developed these deeply unhealthy, toxic survival mechanisms just to pass as neurotypical without even knowing it at that age. We wrapped ourselves in this anxiety like shield, using fear as fuel to keep our lives from simply falling apart. We dragged ourselves across the finish line of high school, exhausted, running on empty, and thinking we had finally beaten it. But did we? No. We were just running that marathon with a broken leg, knowing that the floor was about ready to drop out from underneath us at any time. And here's the unfiltered truth about it all. Adrenaline is a limited resource. You can only run on panic for so long before that engine of yours explodes. And for the lost generation, that explosion happened the second we stepped out of the classrooms and into the real world. Because when the structured scaffolding of school and parents vanished, the walls came fucking crashing in, and they came crashing in hard. That is exactly where we're going to go next week in episode 2. We're going to be talking about what life was like the moment we stepped out of the classrooms and had responsibilities and jobs, and what it actually started to do to that mask and to ourselves and our symptoms. So the next episode is called The Adult Wall. What happens to those undiagnosed brains when it hits those your 20s and 30s? We're going to be talking about the burnout epidemic, the career chaos, and why so many of us spent 15 years taking antidepressants that didn't work because our doctors were trying to put out the anxiety smoke, completely blind to the ADHD fire. Now, if this episode has hit home for you, do me a favor and share it with a friend who grew up in the 90s. All right. Leave a review. Let's make sure that our generation isn't lost anymore. Share it with a fellow ADHDer who needs to hear this. And like I said, I hope you all come back for episode 2 of this special 4-part series titled The ADHD Lost Generation. I appreciate you all for listening. I'll see you next week. This is Wild Focus.